So my sincere thanks to you both for joining CIRS. As you know, we have a project on the current pandemic and its consequences, primarily in the policy realm and in the policy arena. But it's a thrill and an honor to be joined by the two of you and to be able to discuss for the next half hour or so some of the dimensions of this current pandemic. And if I may, Daniel, start with you. Given your specialty and expertise, what are some of the lessons that previous epidemics or pandemics have taught us that we can apply for this current pandemic as we try and navigate dynamics in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and at work?
Yes, well, first, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I'm in a little bit of a public place, so you might hear some background information. So first of all, I think it's very important from my point of view, now that we're several months into this pandemic, to understand that, in my opinion, we really are in an unprecedented situation in terms of the first human coronavirus pneumonia pandemic. So this is the third coronavirus pneumonia after the severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, in 2003, and then MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, in 2012 until today, still 2020. But neither one of those, fortunately, has spread around the world and caused a true pandemic like this coronavirus pneumonia, which is, the virus is called SARS coronavirus 2. The disease, as we know, is COVID-19, since it started in 2019. So we can learn certain lessons from SARS and MERS, and I would say also from pandemic influenza, particularly in our lifetimes. Well, my lifetime's kind of old, so actually 3 pandemics of influenza, 57, 58, 68, 69, and then 2009 and 2010. But fortunately for humans, none of these 3 pandemics of influenza were nearly as bad as this pandemic of coronavirus, COVID-19. And really you have to go all the way back to 1918, 1919, and perhaps into 1920, those 3 years of pandemic influenza, in my opinion, to find anything as bad as this. Of course, the world back then was so different in terms of travel, in terms of total population, in terms of the 1918, 1920 lack of intensive care units, lack of antibiotics. We hadn't even discovered influenza virus itself. So despite modern healthcare, we still have very, very high number of people who have died, and I'm afraid many more people will die, both in the Northern Hemisphere, but also in the coming, what I call the COVID winter in the Southern Hemisphere, June, July, August, when both COVID-19 and also influenza will be occurring, I'm afraid, in much higher numbers than they are now. So basic things that we can learn from the past are about how to prevent the transmission, whether it's through the air, wearing masks, washing hands, through contact, through good education, in terms of providing the best possible healthcare. But again, for everything that we can learn from the past, there's something new today. So the last thing I want to emphasize, and again, it's really through self-interest as a healthcare worker, is that this virus has infected many, many tens of thousands, probably more than 100,000 now worldwide, healthcare workers. China reported over 3,300 healthcare workers infected. Spain's over 30,000. Many other countries in Europe and the United States, well over 10,000. In Iran, I'm not sure of the exact number, but I'm afraid it's very high in terms of healthcare workers being infected. And I only mention this not only out of my own self-interest, but also just to emphasize that despite everything we've learned about SARS and MERS and influenza, Ebola, we still haven't been able to prevent even the healthcare workers from getting infected. So while there are some things that can be learned from past epidemics and pandemics, for this pandemic of COVID-19, there are multiple things that are unprecedented and emphasize the lack of preparedness and the lack of appropriate response once the pandemic was recognized. And that applies to countries around the world so far, across the Northern Hemisphere primarily. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ayman, as Daniel just mentioned, this is something that has been unprecedented in scale. And we know that the first incidences of infection were reported in China. And then quickly after China, Iran became one of the epicenters. And in fact, in Iran, it was the religious city of Qom. Your expertise is Islamic bioethics. Does Islam, and particularly Islamic bioethics, in any way deal with infectious diseases of this kind? Is there a body of jurisprudence or other teachings in Islam that deal with infectious diseases?
First of all, let me start by thanking you, Mahran. Thanks, Sears, for this kind invitation and for the opportunity to share some thoughts about this very important and timely issue. Bioethics, as a newly emerging field that traces its beginnings to the second half of the 20th century, investigates moral questions in the life sciences. It addresses the moral issues associated with modern medical procedures, as well as various applications of modern medical technology. But bioethics is not entirely new, as it also builds on the classical field of medical ethics, which is as old as the profession of medicine itself. Considering the fact that the occurrence of epidemics is not a new phenomenon, we can see that earlier episodes of epidemics have generated extensive discussions on how to respond to such catastrophic events in light of their enormous social and economic consequences, but mainly due to the large numbers of human casualties. Within the Muslim context, these discussions address topics involving the interface between religious and natural causes, such as the necessity of medical treatment, contagion, and also quarantine. In general, most debates within these classical ethical discussions center around one main tension. That is the tension between the safety of individuals on the one hand, and social life and communal bonds on the other. In other words, while these discussions investigate best ways to protect the personal lives of individuals by emphasizing the importance of preventing the spread of diseases through contagion, they also emphasize the need to attend to communal responsibilities. This includes how to provide care for the poor and the needy, how to attend to those who are already infected, those who are seriously ill, or those who are dying, and finally, how to honor those who have already died and treat bodies or their bodies with due respect and dignity by performing the ritual bath and prayer, as well as undertaking proper burial procedures. So to come back to your question, yes, there is already plenty of resources of moral reflections on questions involving infectious diseases and contagion. Contemporary discussions seek to situate the new questions that the new pandemic has raised within the larger context of these earlier resources. Some of the critical questions that need addressing in light of the current pandemic are also tied to the tension I mentioned before between individual safety and communal needs and responsibilities. But of course, after factoring in the realities of the modern setting in terms of current social, political, and economic circumstances, whether at national or international levels. These questions include purely religious or theological questions, such as those investigating the causes of these epidemics and the extent to which these causes are moral or purely natural, and how to reconcile these events in light of theological beliefs in a compassionate and merciful God. They also include a number of questions that have to do with rituals, such as impact on prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and also charity. Still, they also include a range of social questions that have to do with rights to medical care, priorities in providing care, and also allocation of scarce medical resources.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, Ayman just referred to some of the rituals that are done, for example, in Islam in terms of burial of the dead, for example, and the ritual washing of the body. In your opinion, are governments doing enough, and are they doing the right things currently to counter the spread of the pandemic, both in the West and elsewhere, particularly if you can comment here in the Islamic world?
Thank you for that question. First, I want to say I'm not really an expert on the epidemic or the pandemic in the Islamic world. I did make a 3-week trip, February 11th, to China, to Hong Kong, and to Shanghai and the mainland, and then I came to Cairo to try to understand a bit about the pandemic in the Middle East. But I'm certainly not an expert. So I think that there's a lot of controversy about whether countries are doing enough, and even in my country, in the United States, whether individual cities and states, governors of states, mayors of cities, as well as the federal government here in Washington, D.C., are doing enough to prevent the transmission and the spread of the virus within this country, but also between countries. It's quite controversial and quite politically charged in this country, as you may well know, with regard to travel bans, with regard to opening cities. So I think there's a lot of controversy about the adequacy of what countries are doing, but also within countries. For example, here, perhaps there's less controversy about China, because I think what China did starting January 23rd with Wuhan, and then 2 days later with all the other cities in Hubei province, so where Wuhan is the capital, I think there was more of a uniform nationwide policy in China than there has been in this country, in the United States, that is. And in addition, there's obviously been a lot of controversy with regard to guidance from the World Health Organization, their interaction initially with China, and the perceptions, and what's been said recently by the U.S. government here in Washington about the origin of the virus, which I'd just like to say that, in my opinion, I'm not aware of any evidence that this virus came out of a laboratory, either intentionally or accidentally, in Wuhan or anywhere else. That's my best understanding after looking into that question a lot. So in the Islamic world, as you asked me, my comments really are necessarily limited because of my limited information and knowledge. I did note, though, that there's been a lot of activity to try to prevent spread of the infection, and to take measures. For example, I saw that Emirates Air, I think, was the first airline anywhere in the world to announce that they were going to start testing people before they got on the planes. And also a policy which just now is being followed in the United States of wearing masks for passengers on planes. So I think that there's a lot that can and should be learned by countries in different parts of the world. And I think that, and again, it's just my opinion, living here in Washington, I want to be careful what I say, but I think that countries like the United States, really in the beginning, in January, February, March, we could have learned more about what was happening and had happened in China and in Europe and if possible in Iran. But we didn't really learn those lessons. And subsequently, I think that there needs to be more open sharing of information, whether it's through individuals or organizations. So I'd like to stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Ayman, is this precedented, the closure or stopping Umrah Umrah Hajj, and is the scale and the extent, has there been such a thing in terms of affecting Islamic rituals? As you know, for example, in many Muslim countries, mosques are closed, Friday prayers are not taking place. We're now in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, and Taraweeh is not taking place. Do you know if this has a historical precedence?
Several historical precedents before. Since, as we discussed before, epidemics is not a new kind of phenomenon in history, including the Muslim world, of course, or Muslim territories. Earlier generations of jurists, ethicists, of course, they had to grapple with the host of questions that occurrence like these usually raise. But when we talk about questions of legitimacy and illegitimacy, we have to know that these questions are determined on the basis of several guidelines in Sharia. So these questions are answered by Sharia experts or jurists. The outbreak of the coronavirus has triggered juristic discussions to address its various, mainly religious and moral implications. So with the announcement by the World Health Organization on March 11 that the current coronavirus outbreak represents a global pandemic, several Islamic juristic councils and institutions throughout the Muslim world issued statements on this topic. Most of these institutions have endorsed, for example, the suspension of congregational prayers in order to limit the spread of the disease. I can, of course, go on and give you a list of the number of institutions that have already issued statements, but I can say that some of the most prominent institutions or councils worldwide actually have done that, including transnational ones as well. So the decision to suspend, for example, congregational prayer is made by appeal to certain scriptural sources, and also in light of historical precedents, as I noted before, going all the way to the Prophet himself, Prophet of Islam. These sources speak about the permissibility of suspending congregational prayers or other religious collective activities in cases of fear or illness, and also in cases of extreme or adverse circumstances. In order to explain this decision, we need to keep in mind that the moral structure of Sharia includes two main dimensions. The first provides the general vision that inspires and undergirds the various legal rulings, mainly in normal and ordinary circumstances. According to this vision, Sharia ultimately aims to safeguard, protect, and preserve five main values. And these are religion, life, intellect, progeny, and property. However, in cases of necessity or even extreme need, that is, cases that threaten these main values, exceptions can be made in order to maintain and preserve them. Several legal principles and maxims have been developed in the juristic tradition, which are often used to justify these cases or other exceptions, which include, for example, necessities override prohibitions, removal of hardship and distress, difficulty triggers ease, no harm shall be inflicted or received. And also, interestingly perhaps, the government can take action to specify or to limit the boundaries of what's allowed in order to serve the public good. Since this pandemic threatens people's lives in case they come into contact with each other, an exception can be made to forego congregational prayers. Instead, prayers can be performed individually or with one's family at home. The call to prayer can still be made with the condition that people are not asked to come to the mosque, but to pray at home. In some instances, recommendations were made that Friday prayer, for example, can be held in one mosque at the national level, that is, with a limited number of individuals after taking necessary precautions, I think this is being done now in Qatar as we speak, both for Friday and also for the Taraweeh, since you mentioned Taraweeh prayer. This prayer can then be broadcast so that people can view it remotely. There are disagreements on whether people can actually follow or pray behind the Imam virtually in this case. The majority view does not allow this possibility due to the condition that the physical connection between the Imam and those following him should not be interrupted. Broadcasting the prayer in this case is meant primarily to share the Friday sermon, not to perform congregational prayer virtually. Instead, people are encouraged to pray the regular noon prayer at home.
Thank you. Daniel and Ayman, you've both been very generous with your time. Let me ask one last question. Daniel, how do you see things as we move forward? Can you offer some thoughts on the direction of the pandemic, and is there an end in sight?
This is a very difficult question to answer. In other words, to accurately predict the future. Predicting the past is easier. But in all seriousness, I think that there are many challenges ahead. I think that there will be more outbreaks in cities and also in rural areas in multiple countries around the world. I think that because no one in our species, no humans, 7.5 billion people around the world have any pre-existing immunity protection against the infection, that the virus will continue to spread. Even now in the Northern Hemisphere, as the weather gets warmer, I think the number of patients will go down, but it will still not be zero. It will continue to spread even in the summer, June, July, August in the Northern Hemisphere. And it will go up at the same time during the COVID winter in the Southern Hemisphere, June, July, August. And partly why I say that is because if you look at countries, including some in the Middle East, obviously, but also Singapore, looking back to parts of Asia where the outbreak started earlier, there's been transmission already, even though the temperature is quite warm. And so I'm afraid that the pandemic is going to continue for 1 year, 2 years, much like the 1918, 1919, and 1920 pandemic of influenza did over a century ago. I think that unlike SARS in 2002 and 2003, which never got established in the Southern Hemisphere, only in the Northern Hemisphere, primarily in certain places in Asia, as we know, China, Singapore, Hanoi, and then Toronto, Canada, but it never got established in the Southern Hemisphere. But of course, this SARS coronavirus 2 COVID-19 pandemic is already in many countries in the Americas, Africa, Indonesia, Australia, in the Southern Hemisphere. So I think it's going to become like influenza, where it goes on year round between the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. And that makes it really bad news, because many more people will be exposed and infected, more people will suffer and die, because I don't think we'll have a vaccine in the coming year. And I hope that we have some effective, or I should say highly effective, antiviral treatments, which we do not have at this time, not highly effective ones. So I would like to say that I could offer a more positive prognosis for what the pandemic is going to do in the coming months and years, but this is my more realistic assessment.
Thank you, Daniel. Ayman, do you have any final thoughts to share with us?
Yes, I was kind of looking to hear perhaps a more optimistic prediction or expectation, but at least, you know, let's hope. But I think I agree with Daniel. The anxiety will continue until effective treatment is discovered, or ideally a vaccine is discovered. But on the other hand, I think people in general will need to learn how to adapt and how to cope with this new reality. Definitely life will go on. We will just have to find alternative ways, means, and methods to do what we need to do. Also, on the other hand, I think there are so many lessons that we collectively, as families, as communities, and as humanity in general, we can learn from this. Most importantly, there are important lessons in humility that we need to just know that, that we are not that invincible after all, and that we are still vulnerable. But also, since now we are spending more time at home, perhaps there is an opportunity to connect more with our families, with both, if not in a direct kind of tangible way, then at least, through also social, technological means. I mean, with extended family and friends and everyone, basically. Yeah, it is a learning curve for everyone. I think everyone is doing this kind of soul searching and trying to find, what we can learn from this experience. But I usually like to focus more on the positive side than on the negative. Perhaps it's offering an opportunity for people to focus more on what is important, perhaps more important or most important. For academics, perhaps, more time and opportunity to focus on, delayed, postponed kind of projects. Yeah, and I just hope that we also, as a human family, will find ways to support each other in a more effective ways, to pay more attention to those who are in need, people who need care, people who are, less fortunate, perhaps. And yeah, I hope we'll just be able to do that collectively, and we'll get through it.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. I'm most grateful to both of you for your insights and your perspectives. In all likelihood, this will continue for some time to come. And with your permission, we might call on your, impose or abuse your kindness again, and call on your expertise and insights. My sincere thanks on behalf of the entire CIRS team. Thank you very much, and good day to you both. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Malcolm.